Hi there. We are Jim and Jonna Schuster, and this is a glimpse into our world.
Conversations from our living room. Unscripted, without agenda, prompted by the Holy Spirit.
And usually over coffee.
About what God is saying to us right now.
No promises on what you'll get. Rev bombs, rants, breakthroughs, victories. It's all fair game.
But we hope it's a place of encountering the depths of the Lord together.
So come explore with us here on the Catholic Revival Ministries podcast.
Hey, everyone. Well, typically our podcast episodes are casual conversations between me and Jim, or Jim and me and a guest, about what God is doing in our lives at the moment. But we are going to be doing something a little bit different in these upcoming few episodes. We are actually going to be doing a 5-part series on the topic of hearing God's voice. So on top of this topic being a pressing need in the church and something that is very strongly on our hearts and on our mission at Catholic Revival Ministries, we also have some exciting news to share that I have written a book on this topic of hearing God's voice. So to accompany this book, I wanted to have some conversations where we could flesh out the topic a little bit more thoroughly so that I could give readers and potential readers an experience of being accompanied through the process of learning to hear God's voice so that they feel as equipped as possible for learning this skill for themselves.
Yeah, so over the next few episodes, Jonna will be interviewing some guests on this topic. But to get the ball rolling here in part 1 of the series, I'm going to step into the interviewer role and I will be interviewing our brand new author, Jonna. So, Jonna, welcome.
Oh, why, thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
So first off, congratulations. I'm
Thanks.
so proud of the work that you put into this and the finished product. And I know that there was quite a lot of effort to get this book out there. And that's not only the short-term writing process that you went through, but it's also all the time over the past few years, really refining this message. And that has come in the form of really coaching dozens of people through this process. And you've been able to kind of hone this message into a way that's really going to land well with people and help propel them into being able to hear God's voice more clearly in their lives. So I just want to start by kind of pulling on that experience and asking you, when people take the Hearing God's Voice course with you, what do you find that they're looking for? Like, what draws them to the course to begin with?
Thank you for saying all that, Jim. I appreciate that. And that's an excellent question. Typically, what draws people to take the Hearing God's Voice course or a workshop or study this topic in depth is really a desire to deepen their relationship with the Lord, to know Him and to be known by Him more deeply. And I find that either one, they've heard or seen other people talk about a more dialogue-based prayer life of hearing from God, and they want to learn how to experience that for themselves. Or two, they've experienced occasions where they actually think they have been hearing from God in prayer already, but they could use some help confirming and understanding their experience and bringing some greater intentionality to it. And I also find that many times what becomes a catalyst for people who kind of finally bring themselves to take that step of, I really want to learn this stuff, is that they find themselves in a situation where they could really use God's input on something. Like they're looking for an answer to some question on their hearts, whether that's some kind of practical, what do I do? Or some kind of desire to hear God's truth be spoken more personally into their lives or into their hearts. And that kind of nudges them forward to start taking some action into learning this stuff.
Yeah. You mentioned a more dialogue-based prayer life. Could you expound on that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I talk about this in the book to start with, the difference between one-way prayer and two-way prayer. And a dialogue-based prayer is sort of this idea of, in contrast to the sort of prayer where I'm speaking to the Lord and things are going outward from me to Him, that's a very one-way prayer. But a dialogue-based prayer is two ways in that I'm both speaking to the Lord and then hearing from Him in response. And so there's this back and forth hearing, speaking between myself and the Lord. And that's sort of the thing that people have been growing in hunger for. Yeah. It's kind of like, who wants to be talking to a wall? You know, no one does that in real life with normal human relationships. It's not satisfying to have friendships that you are doing all the talking or all the listening. Two-way dialogue is what really brings a richness to a relationship. And so by extension, it brings a richness to our relationship with the Lord when we learn how to cultivate that sort of dynamic in our prayer lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that naturally lends itself to people receiving input, like you said, on decisions that they might want to make. Like
Exactly.
they want like guidance from the Lord, like the one who loves us and is steering our lives for the better and everything. So
yeah, exactly.
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So now that you have like put this into book form, what are you hoping people will take away from the book specifically?
Well, for one thing, I will name that this book is not meant to be like a treatise on the entirety of prayer or the spiritual life or the interior life. It's really a focus on helping people to develop the skill of recognizing and discerning the ways that God speaks to them personally, and then how to make hearing God a regular part of their life. And I'll also share that I actually have had this book within me for quite a long time, and I have been hesitant to write it because I very strongly feel that learning this, I call it a skill, but it's really more of an art, the art of listening for God and developing those discernment tools and developing a more dialogue-based relationship in prayer with Him. I really feel like that journey is something that deserves accompaniment. And there's so much room for people to, if you don't have a full grasp of the certain theological underpinnings or the character and nature of God, or even who we are in Christ, if you don't have that piece firmly in place, or if you, let's say, don't know what to listen for when you're listening for God's voice, it could really shape the way that they proceed forward. And I would hate to do them a disservice by trying to teach this in a manner that doesn't offer the sort of full accompaniment with that sort of clarity and guidance and direction that they deserve. That's going to keep them really anchored in a place of firm understanding and also feeling confident that they're hearing from the Lord and taking action on that. And so it took me so long to write this book because I couldn't solve the problem of how do I offer an accompanying experience to someone in a book form in order to do this subject justice. Jesus discipled people. How do you disciple someone through a book? And so that was the main obstacle that I had to overcome in writing it. And so my additional hope of something that I would like people to take away from reading the book is an experience of being accompanied through the process or being discipled through the process, through the manner in which I chose to write it, and to sort of bolster the teachings with practical exercises and the sense of someone is walking me through this.
Yeah. And the reason you're able to do that is because you've actually been doing that with so many people just through one-on-one coaching. And you've heard so many people's stories, and you've fielded their questions, and you've observed their struggles and also their triumphs. You've seen how they get the breakthrough and all of that. So that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, what are some of the most common questions you get from people on this topic? Or what are some of the common challenges that you see them encounter?
I would say that one of the big obstacles that people have to overcome, sort of the first hurdle, I guess you could say chronologically, is that a lot of people struggle overcoming the belief that God would speak to them. This concept that they are deserving of connection with the Lord, that He actually looks at them with kindness and compassion and generosity, that He desires to have a deep, intimate relationship with Him. And to overcome that disposition that we have towards holding Him at an arm's length or at a distance because we feel unworthy or we have some kind of beliefs wrapped up in that. And so that's a very common obstacle that people have to overcome as a first step. But typically, speaking from my own experience, usually by the time that clients reach me, where they're actually actively seeking, how do I hear from God in prayer? They've already wrestled with that on their own and overcome it. And so now they're just kind of pushing forward and saying, all right, now that I believe that this is possible, that it's true, that I'm disposed for it, how do I do it?
Mm-hmm.
And so the main role that I'm providing at that point in the coaching has really been to provide people with the practical training of how to listen for and distinguish God's voice.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you give our listeners an overview of how you walk people through this process of growing in learning to hear God's voice through this book?
Ooh, yeah. So my goal was to write this book as though I was personally guiding the reader through this process of learning to hear God's voice. So I write it in a very accompanying sort of way, like I'm their friend, their trusted friend who's just sharing what I know. And so basically the book is broken into 3 parts. The first part focuses on the sort of theological groundwork about what are the truths of our faith that we can rest on, that communicate that we are not only able to hear God, but he is the sort of God who speaks, who wants to speak to us, and that we are disposed to be able to hear him. Yeah. Not just like it's possible, but it's actually in our nature to be able to hear him. And then I kind of go through some of the pitfalls that people might fall into in wrestling with those sort of principles. Yeah. And then section 2 of the book is all about getting practical. And okay, now that we know that we can hear from God, how do we do it? What does that look like? And so I break that into 4 subsections. Step 1 is listening. What does it look like to listen? How do we listen? Yeah. Step 2 is discerning, which is after we've listened and we've heard something, how do we discern whether what we've heard is from God or not? Step 3 is, okay, whatever we heard and we've identified whatever it was it from God or was it not? What do we do with it? How do we steward it? And then step 4 is sort of troubleshooting. You know, how do I overcome some of the things that are keeping me from hearing God?
Yeah, so if I could jump in real quick, could you expound a little bit more on the listening piece? Like when we're talking about hearing God's voice, what does it look like? I mean, what should people expect it to look like?
Yeah, well, I don't want to spoil the book too much, but I'm the sort of person who benefits from thinking about things a little bit more systematically. So the way that I teach it is I actually break it into several categories, 4 different categories of how God can speak. I call them languages, the languages that God speaks through. Now, the idea behind this is that if we don't know what we're looking for, what we're paying attention for when we're listening, we're not going to hear it. We're not going to catch it. And so I want to basically put on people's radar all of the possible ways that God could be communicating. And the reason that I do it this way is because I've found that in my, my whole life's spiritual journey, it's been sort of elusive to me when people talk about hearing God, like, oh, God can speak through a conversation from a loved one. God can speak through a Sunday homily. God can speak through scripture, more personally.
Or what I've found is sometimes, like, for so long, I would hear people say, oh, I heard God say this. And I'm like, what does that mean? It seemed like some people just sort of had it. And I was just like, I don't know what that means,
Yeah, exactly. And so I wanted to just put everything on the table to say, here are all of the ways that he could speak to you. Yeah. But then I grouped those ways together in a manner that can almost help posture us to listen better. And so the 4 languages that I propose are God can speak through the language of hearing, through the language of seeing, through the language of feeling, and through the language of thinking. So we can hear from God, whether that's we have internal thoughts or we hear him speak through the voice of another. We can see in our mind's eye images. We can look out at the world around us and have something in the world externally around us visually catch our attention, and God can communicate to us through that. We can have experiences of feeling emotionally or even physically, and God can speak through that. We can have experiences of thoughts or memories or ideas that come to mind in prayer, and that could be God communicating. And so I sort of propose these 4 different categories and break them down in subcategories to help people basically, if they want to practice listening in one particular language versus another, you can hone it. You can try exercising. I'm going to listen through the language of hearing today, or I'm going to listen through the language of feeling today. And what that looks like is I'm going to pay attention to what I experience in that particular language. I'm going to pay attention to what I am hearing in my external surroundings. I'm going to pay attention to what I'm experiencing physically and emotionally during this time. It's just, what are you aware of and paying attention to while you are in prayer, so that you can be on the lookout in case God is communicating to you through that means.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I think we were at the Arboretum recently, and you said something like, "Oh, do you hear that bird?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I didn't until you pointed it out." It was like I wasn't paying attention to it, even though it was there the whole time. But just the fact that you called my attention to it meant, oh, now I'm hearing it. Now I'm aware of the bird. So I feel like the process you described is very similar, just by becoming aware of those different voices or modes by which God might speak. Then it helps people to become more aware.
Exactly. And the first step of listening is to simply become aware of what you're experiencing while you're in prayer. And that takes effort. It takes a concerted intentionality that you bring into prayer. And you have to actually, you can't go on autopilot, at least not at the start. You have to actually practice.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So I won't spoil anymore. You'll have to read the book to get the further details about that. But I do find that people that I've coached through this have shared that they either have the experience of they didn't realize that God was able to speak to them through that language. And so it almost opened up a new possibility for them of, oh, now I can start paying attention to that. Or they find that, wow, I've been experiencing that my whole life and I never knew that was God. I thought that was just human nature. That was just me being me. And so it validated what they were already experiencing, and it put a name to it. It put the voice of God to it as an attribute rather than them dismissing it. So then they knew how to steward it accordingly. So it's the intention is to basically help people become acquainted with the ways that God could be speaking, and over time start to recognize the patterns of how he tends to speak to them, so that they don't have to be quite so dialed in or, focused
or effortful.
After a time it becomes just like second nature.
So that was thank you for sharing all that. That was section 2 of the book. Tell us about section 3 now.
So section 3 wraps up the book, and that's where basically we take everything, all the tools and strategies that we've talked about in terms of how to hear God's voice and develop that dialogue with him, and apply it to deepen the relationship of prayer that you have with him. So how to go deeper into listening prayer through Lectio Divina, through Ignatian prayer, through journaling, and then also how to apply it to living your everyday life. How do you utilize this new skill, quote unquote skill, in your professional life? How do you seek God's voice for input on certain questions that you're asking, that you need to ask him about in your own just secular journey? Yeah,
that's great. So what are the impacts that you have seen from people who have walked through this process with you? And, do you have any favorite stories of breakthrough moments for people who are growing in this area?
Well, I would say I'm not sure I would want to share too much from my experience with my clients. I just want to protect their privacy and not disclose their own personal stories. But I will say that in our upcoming podcast episodes, we are going to be interviewing 4 people who have gone through the process of learning how to hear God's voice through the ways that we have taught it. And they'll be sharing firsthand what their experience was like and the breakthroughs that they've experienced. But I will note that I do see a common thread with most people who have gone through this experience of learning to hear from God. And that common thread is that once they learn this, it's really something that sticks with them forever. It's really something that has a ripple effect through the rest of their lives. Like they, a number of them, it's been years since they first learned these things. And to this day, it's just a part of their life. It's a part of who they are. They live it, they breathe it. And it's forever shaped the way that they engage with the Lord and what the relationship with him looks like. And so I know it's a little bit more vague of a description, but I do find it very striking just how much mileage you can get out of this one skill of learning to hear him speak.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm excited to hear those stories of people sharing their own experience and how it made a difference in their lives and in their relationship with God.
Yeah.
So Jonna, thank you so much for sharing about the book, and
My
I'm
pleasure.
so excited for it. But one last question for you is, what is your book called and where can people get it?
Excellent question, Jim. My book is called Hearing God's Voice, A Catholic Guide to Listening Prayer, and it is available on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited for this book to be coming out. And because I was kind of part of your process and helping you proofread and everything, I have probably read through the book 5 or 6 times now. And every time I read it, I am just so blown away by how well written it is, how clear it is, how fun and engaging, and some of your playfulness comes through. And I really love that about it too. So I can't wait for people to get their hands on it and read it and just be really positively impacted by it.
Thank you. Me too.